is dead, but the King of Kings, the Lord Yahweh, is on the throne. He's actively ruling. Are you nervous about the world when you turn on the news? Are you nervous about the direction that maybe your town or your state or your country is going in? Jakarta, where we live, it's the capital. They've seen a number of riots and deaths. Anytime there's an election, there's huge riots, and we have to kind of go into lockdown for a couple days. It's hard for us not to be unsettled when that happens. And the world is growing, it feels like more unstable every day. Friends, elections will come and go, leaders will rise and fall. But God is always on his throne. He's presently ruling and reigning. And his throne is the command control center of the universe. Every heart that's ever beats on command from this throne. Every wind that has ever blown is directed by this throne. The orbit of the galaxies around each other is orchestrated by this throne. God has unrivaled supremacy. He is high and lifted up, it said. He's infinitely higher above all his creation. Isaiah will write later that the nations are like grasshoppers compared to God. And here's the thing, we don't put God on the throne. We don't elect him. He doesn't have to compete with or defeat anyone else to claim the throne. It's his. He doesn't need your help. God's not up in heaven hoping against hope that people will just make the right decisions and be nice and work with him so he can accomplish his plans. No, God is absolutely sovereign. He has unrivaled supremacy. He is unstoppable. So God is there. God is on the throne. And next we see that God's power, his rule, overflows into his majesty. God is majestic. It says that the train of his robe filled the temple. Now, what does that mean? Well, honestly, I'm not exactly sure. and I kind of think that that's part of the point, right? So train could be translated as hem. I think the idea is that the train or the cape or the hem of his robe as he's seated on the throne, it fills the temple. And if that's the case, then how big was the throne? And how big is the one sitting on the throne? In other words, I think Isaiah's kind of grasping at images here to describe something that tries to capture the greatness and the majesty of this true God. I think it's like those moments where maybe you've been out in nature and you've seen something in creation that has just taken your breath away, and you can't really capture the full feeling of awe and wonder that you have. You've tried to put it into words and you just aren't able to. I think that's what's happening here. I think Isaiah is trying to describe something that we can't really comprehend right now. The majesty of the glory of God. And this majesty then rightly necessitates the constant worship of God by those who are in his presence. We see that in verse 2. Right? It says, above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So we get this image of the seraphim. Okay, well, who are these guys? Who are the seraphim? And this chapter is actually the only place in the Bible that they are named. Right? The word seraphim, it's literally translated burning ones. right? God's very servants are flames of fire. These servants of God have one constant function, is to lead the host of heaven in continuous worship of the one who sits on the throne. It says, with one set of wings they fly, with another they cover their feet. I think this is supposed to bring to mind, again, Moses' experience with God at the burning bush. Take off your shoes, for you're in the presence of the Holy One, holy ground, right? Even in Indonesia, same thing. That culture is you're supposed to take off your shoes in the presence of someone who's respectful or who's respected. One set covers their feet. The last set, their faces are covered in holy fear. Just think about this. The most awesome and terrifying creatures in heaven hide their faces in awe and fear of the holiness of God. These are not silly babies in diapers playing harps, right? These are terrifying creatures of fire whose voices cause the earth to shake and would melt you with a look. And not even they can look God in the eyes. Not even they feel worthy enough to even show their feet in the presence of the King. Friends, this is what heaven is for. This is what creation is for. This is what you are for. The continual praise and worship of God. But what exactly are they worshiping God for? Specifically, they're worshiping him for his holiness. Right? That's the fifth thing we see. We see that God is holy. Verse 3. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now, holiness is not just one attribute of God out of many. Right? It's the attribute of God that informs and describes every other aspect of who he is and what he does. Right? I like how John Piper puts it. He said, every effort to define the holiness of God ultimately winds up by saying, God is holy means God is God. Right? God's holiness is God's godness, the perfection of all that God is. Perhaps the best word that we have to try to begin to describe holiness, I think, is transcendence, right? He's transcendent in every way. There's none like him. He's not only quantitatively different from all creation, he's qualitatively different from all creation. His power is unlike any other power. His beauty is unlike any other. His wisdom, his justice, his love, his presence, his purity is unlike any other. He is holy. But he's not just holy, he's holy, holy, holy. Right? You may know this in ancient Near Eastern literature. To repeat something is to emphasize it, right? It's a literary device that's common in the Bible. Indonesian language is actually similar. If they want to emphasize something, they'll repeat it, and that sometimes multiplies it. So child is anak, children is anak-anak, you know. Or heart is hati. But pay attention is hati-hati, right? It's give your heart to this. Be careful. Many times in Scripture we see Jesus saying, truly, truly, I say to you, or old versions, verily, verily, right? This is a way of emphasizing the importance and the truthfulness of what he was going to say, right? But no attribute of God is ever elevated to the third degree, except his holiness, right? God's not called love, love, love. God's not called wrath, wrath, wrath. God's not called wisdom, wisdom, wisdom. But he is holy, holy, holy. Friends, eternity will not be enough time to exhaust our praise of God's holiness. Now, how does Isaiah respond to this encounter with the holy God? like any sane person would do. He falls apart. Isaiah learns that God, in his majestic holiness, is terrifying to sinners. Look at verses 4 and 5. It says, the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a